Hey, welcome to Dreamland Tales. Today, we will embark on a magical journey together, exploring stories that are full of fantasy and wonder. Whether it's a brave little hero or a clever little animal, each story holds wisdom and warmth. Are you ready? Let's open the door to our imagination and enter this world of color and laughter. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful and prosperous kingdom. The king of the kingdom was wise and powerful, the queen was gentle and kind, and they were loved by the people. However, the king and the queen had a knot in their hearts, that is, they had no children for many years. Day after day, year after year, the queen's stomach remained still, and they went around seeking medicine and praying to the gods. Finally, after a long wait, the good news of the queen's pregnancy spread throughout the kingdom. The king and the queen were overjoyed, and they began to prepare for their new arrival. The queen's pregnancy was very peaceful, and as the due date approached, the king decided to organize a big and grand christening ceremony for their child. They chose the day carefully and invited 12 of the most prestigious fairies in the kingdom to attend. To show his respect for the fairies, the king ordered 12 sets of exquisite gold cutlery to be made, each set of which was inlaid with brilliant gemstones that sparkled charmingly in the sunlight. On the day of the christening ceremony, the whole palace was decorated with lights and colors. The court musicians played cheerful music, and the servants carried sumptuous food and wine among the guests. The 12 fairies entered the palace auditorium one by one, dressed in gorgeous garments and with blessed smiles. Just as the fairies were about to start blessing the unborn child, suddenly an eerie laughter broke the cheerful atmosphere. The crowd looked in horror, only to see the 13th fairy appear in the doorway. She was dressed in black robes, and her eyes were filled with resentment. It turned out that this fairy hadn't received an invitation, and she felt that she had been greatly insulted, so harboring a grudge, she decided to come and ruin the joyous ceremony. The first 12 fairies were not affected by this sudden turn of events, and they began to bestow their beautiful blessings on the princess in turn. The first fairy waved her wand and mouthed some words, blessing the princess with a beauty that would make everything in the world pale before her. The second fairy gave the princess incomparable wisdom, so that she could distinguish right from wrong and see all the mysteries of the world. The third fairy gave the princess a kind heart, so that she would be full of love for everything in the world, and be able to understand and help everyone in need. The fourth fairy gave the princess a kind heart, so that she would be able to understand and help everyone in need. The fourth fairy gave the princess a kind heart, so that she would be able to understand and help everyone in need. And the fourth fairy gave the princess a kind heart, so that she would be able to understand and help everyone in need. The fourth fairy gives the princess an elegant temperament, exuding a charming charm between her hands and feet, as if she were a fairy coming out of a painting. The fifth fairy blesses the princess with the ability to sing and dance, singing like a nightingale and dancing like a butterfly. The sixth fairy grants the princess the qualities of bravery and courage, so that she will not be afraid to face difficulties and dangers, and move forward. The seventh fairy gives the princess the qualities of resilience and strength, and the seventh fairy gives the princess the qualities of courage so that she will not be afraid of facing difficulties and dangers. The seventh fairy gives the princess the perseverance to not give up easily no matter how much frustration she encounters. The eighth fairy gives the princess an optimistic mindset so that she can always see the beauty of life and find the light of hope even in the darkness. The ninth fairy blesses the princess with good health and keeps her away from all the pain and sickness. The 10th fairy gives the princess excellent leadership skills and will lead the kingdom to a more prosperous path in the future. And the 10th fairy gives the princess the courage to be a good leader. The 11th fairy gives the princess a rich imagination so that her mind can soar freely in the marvelous world. The 12th fairy gives the princess the ability to communicate with all things so that she can understand the songs of the birds, the whispers of the wind, and the voices of the flowers, plants, and trees. However, just as the 12th fairy had finished her words of blessing, the 13th fairy stepped forward. She stared viciously at the unborn princess and cursed under her breath, "The princess will die at the age of 15 from a spindle piercing her finger." After saying this, she let out a burst of maniacal laughter and then disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. A dead silence fell over the auditorium, and the people turned pale with fear at this terrible curse. At this time, the 12th fairy stood out, and she said with a grave expression, "This curse is too powerful, I can't eliminate it. But the princess will not die, she will just sleep for 100 years. When the king and queen heard this, they were slightly relieved, but their hearts were still filled with worry. In order to protect the princess from the curse, the king immediately ordered the destruction of all the spinners in the kingdom. Soldiers searched from house to house and seized all the spindle hammers they found and gathered them in the square to be burned. At the same time, the king also ordered that no one was allowed to make or possess a spindle in the kingdom, and those who disobeyed would be severely punished. In the days that followed, the princess grew up healthy and happy under the love of her parents. She was like a flower in full bloom in spring, growing more beautiful every day. Her skin was as white as snow, her eyes as bright as stars, and her lips as red as cherries. Her smile is as warm as the sunshine, which can dispel the darkness in people's hearts. The princess not only has outstanding appearance, but also under the influence of the fairy's blessing, she is smart, kind-hearted, and elegant. She loved playing in the garden of the palace, keeping company with the flowers, and talking to the birds. She was also passionate about learning all kinds of knowledge and often spent the whole day in the library of the palace. As the princess grew older, she became curious about the world outside the palace. However, for her safety, the king and queen always kept her inside the palace and rarely let her go out. Although the princess was a bit dissatisfied, she also knew that her parents were doing it for her own good, so she could only learn about the outside world through books and other people's stories. One day, when the princess was 15 years old, she was wandering around the palace and unknowingly came to an old tower. The tower was located in a remote corner of the palace and was seldom visited. The walls of the tower were covered with vines and looked a bit gloomy. But the princess's curiosity was fully aroused, and she decided to go into the tower to find out what was going on. The tower was dimly lit and smelled old. The princess walked carefully up the narrow staircase, which creaked with every step as if telling an old story. When she came to a small room on the top floor of the tower, she found an old woman sitting at a spinning wheel spinning yarn. The princess had never seen a spindle before, and she was fascinated by this strange object. The spindle spun rapidly in the old woman's hands, making a humming sound as strands of silk were drawn from the wool. The princess walked up curiously, her eyes sparkling with excitement. When the old woman saw the princess, she smiled and asked her, "My child, how did you come here?" The princess replied, "I was wandering around the palace and saw this tower, so I came in to take a look." "What is it?" "It looks so interesting." The old woman, who did not know the identity of the princess or the curse about the spindle, enthusiastically introduced the princess to the use of the spindle. The princess listened with great interest, and she couldn't help but want to try it herself. The old woman handed the spindle to the princess, who took it carefully and began to spin yarn, imitating the old woman's movements. However, just then, an accident happened. The princess accidentally stabbed her finger with the spindle, and a drop of blood oozed from her fingertip. In an instant, the curse was fulfilled, and the princess felt a wave of dizziness, then fell to the ground and fell into a deep sleep. At the same time, the entire palace looked as if it had been enchanted. The king and queen were discussing matters of state in the hall of the palace, when suddenly they felt a wave of drowsiness, their eyelids became heavier and heavier, and they finally fell asleep in their seats. The attendants were busy serving the king and queen, and the trays in their hands fell to the ground with a clang, and then they also fell asleep. The ministers were discussing the policies of the country, and before they could finish speaking, they fell asleep on the table. The cooks in the kitchen were preparing dinner. The stove fire was still burning, but they also closed their eyes. The horses in the stables were eating hay, but now they also stopped chewing and quietly fell asleep. The dogs in the yard were lying in the sun and no longer moved. The pigeons on the roof stopped cooing and shrunk into a ball and fell asleep. The flies on the wall no longer fluttered and rested quietly there. Not long after, dense thorns began to grow around the royal palace. These thorns spread and grew at an astonishing speed, their vines intertwining with each other, growing higher and higher, growing denser and denser. The thorns were covered with sharp thorns that shone with a cold light in the sunlight. Soon, the thorns shrouded the entire royal palace, and from the outside, there was no trace of the palace at all, as if there had never been a royal palace here. As time passed, the people of the neighboring countries gradually forgot about the palace and the sleeping princess. Occasionally there are a few travelers who pass by this place, see the large thorny bush, but also just thought that this is a piece of ordinary wilderness, did not think that there is a hidden magic palace. The land around the thorn bushes became barren. No animals dared to come near. Only the wind blowing through the thorns made the rustling sound. Many years later, a young prince came to this land. Born in a distant land, the prince was handsome, brave, and fearless, with a desire to explore the unknown. As he traveled, he heard a vague legend from a gray-haired old man about the mysterious things hidden in this thorn bush. The old man told him that the thorn bush seemed to hold unknown secrets, and that some people had once tried to enter it, but were stopped by the thorns and never came out. Brave and curious by nature, the prince decided to explore. When he came to the thorn bushes, he found that they were unusually thick, as if there was a mysterious force preventing people from approaching. The vines of the thorns intertwined with each other to form an impenetrable barrier, and the sharp thorns glittered in the sunlight, making people fearful. But the prince did not retreat. He drew out the sword at his waist, raised it high, and then slashed at the thorns with all his might. The sword collided with the thorns, making a clang-clang sound, and sparks splashed everywhere. Strangely enough, the thorns automatically parted and made way wherever he cut. The prince's heart was full of surprises, and he walked towards the palace with great difficulty along the path that had been opened up. Along the way, the prince saw that everything around him was terribly quiet. The royal palace covered with thorns seemed like a sleeping beast without a trace of life. He entered the palace and saw the king, queen, and ministers asleep in the hall, the attendants fallen on the floor, and the fire still burning in the kitchen, but everything was still. He went on, past the stables and the courtyard, and saw sleeping horses, dogs, doves, and flies, and his mind grew more and more curious. At last he came to the room where the princess slept. The door of the room was half covered, and the prince gently pushed it open and saw the princess lying on the bed. The moment he saw the princess, the prince was struck by her beauty. The princess lay quietly as if she were asleep, her face flushed as if time had stopped on her. Her long hair lay like black satin on the pillow, and her lips were slightly upturned as if she were having a sweet dream. The prince couldn't help but step forward. He gently knelt on the bed and leaned down to kiss the princess. Just then, a miracle happened. The princess slowly opened her eyes with a trace of confusion, as if just waking up from a long dream. As the princess awoke, so did all the sleeping people in the palace. The horses in the stables began to neigh, pawing at the ground with their hooves and shaking their heads excitedly. The dogs in the courtyard began to bark, and they ran around in the yard. The pigeons on the roof circled in the sky, making cheerful cooing noises. The flies on the walls began to flutter, and the whole palace came back to life. When the king and queen awoke, they saw the awakened princess and the prince standing by, and they understood everything. The prince tells the king and queen about his experience and expresses his love for the princess. The king and queen were so impressed by the prince's bravery that they readily agreed to marry the prince and the princess. The prince and the princess fell in love, and they had a grand and lavish wedding. The kings and queens of the neighboring countries were invited, and people came from all directions with precious gifts and good wishes. At the wedding, the prince and the princess were dressed in gorgeous gowns, and they walked into the auditorium hand in hand amidst the cheers of the crowd. From then on, The prince and the princess lived happily ever after, and their country prospered under their joint rule. Thank you, children, for spending this wonderful time with us. I hope these stories will plant seeds of joy and friendship in your hearts. Remember, no matter what difficulties you encounter in life, with courage and love, you will surely find a solution. I look forward to sharing more wonderful stories with you next time. Goodbye, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with marvelous adventures as well.